Hi, and welcome to this section on installing Ansible. For those of you who've just come here from the last section, which was pretty full of diagrams, you're probably hoping that I show you some actual Ansible now, but I can't just stop showing you diagrams cold turkey like that. I need to taper off a bit first with a few more diagrams. With that in mind, this blue box represents the installed instance of Ansible we're about to create. Ansible is run from the command line, and there are two concepts to the program itself it's worth knowing about, that of modules and configuration. Modules are the way Ansible performs specific packets of functionality against the server, such as pinging it, running a command, starting or stopping a service, or copying a package or installing something. There is a mind-boggling array of modules available, hundreds of them, to perform any type of function you can imagine, and a full list of these can be found in the documentation of the Ansible website under Module Index. We don't need to know them all for now though, just knowing that they exist is enough. Configuration covers any global aspect of Ansible you might want to define, such as paths to key parts of the system, general settings, defaults, error levels, and security features. Ansible config can actually be defined in 4 different places, 3 of which are paths to an ansible.config file, and the last of which is by use of an environment variable. I'm deliberately not going to provide the details of these in specifics here, because I only ever plan to use one method throughout this course, and that's to include the ansible.config file in the root directory of the repository itself, which is the most precedent of the 3 file locations. The reason I'm doing this is the only one of the locations that would be version controlled. The others are paths on the local system, either in the home directory or the etc directory. If a setting is required for an Ansible repo to function, my feeling is that the best place for it to live is in the repo itself. If there's settings the repo requires that aren't in that repo, it's not a complete representation of what's required to make it work. Ideally, a repository should contain every piece of information required to function correctly. In any case, the most basic way to call Ansible is in a command such as this. Just as with the Terraform chapter, we're going to start with the simplest possible example, which you'd never really use in the enterprise. So how we end up using Ansible won't look much like we start using it like this, but it's worth seeing this just to get that grounding in its core functionality. The first word in this command is of course Ansible, which defines that that's the program that we're calling. The -m section of the command specifies which module we want to use, which in this case is ping, because it's nice and simple to see it working. And finally, the -i part of the command is short for inventory, and is a list of host names or IP addresses to hit with the ping, separated by commas. Though in this case I'm just specifying one. Notice we still require the comma at the end though. So, if I were to run this command, it would use SSH to check the contactability of a single host, in this case host 1. Notice that it still uses SSH even though it's pinging. This isn't the same as just running a ping command which would use ICMP. Now let's start developing this to be a bit more useful. First thing, instead of specifying a list of hosts in the command line itself, we can move that out into a file. So for example, if I call the file hosts, I could write -i hosts. The main advantage of this is that it makes it easier to have multiple hosts rather than write them all out in the command itself. When there are only 3, like in this diagram, we could feasibly write them out, but imagine if there were thousands and thousands of them, the command would get a bit unwieldy and long. On top of that, inventory files have other functionality and options such as host-specific variables and grouping, and we'll cover a lot of that later in the chapter. Okay, the diagram as it stands now makes a good starting point for us, so let's get on and install Ansible and have a go at creating it. If you've done any of my other chapters, you'll already know that I always work on an Ubuntu VirtualBox machine for these courses, and I strongly recommend you do the same no matter what computer you're running. Full details on why I recommend this and how to install it can be found in the Installing VirtualBox Linux section of the Basics chapter. Let's open up a terminal here, as always, and browse to whichever directory we like to keep our Git repositories in. Knowing Git is also a prerequisite for doing this chapter, and you can learn all about that in the Git section of the Basics too. As we're starting a new chapter, let's make a new repository folder with makedir Ansible and then cd into it. We're going to need to tell Ubuntu where to find Ansible to install it from, by adding the appropriate apt repository details with sudo apt add repository, and then the location, which is ppa:/ansible/ansible. Once that's done, let's do a sudo apt update to update the list of available packages to us. And now we can install Ansible with sudo apt install Ansible. As with Terraform, it's a good idea to use the same version of Ansible as me if you can, and I'm using 2.9.4 for this course. Great! Now it's installed, let's quickly check it's working by typing the command Ansible with no arguments. And there we go. Before we start working on this, we want to create a remote repository that we'll be able to push our changes into. So let's head on over to Firefox here and browse to github.com. I'm already logged in, so we can go straight to Your Repositories. We'll click on New here and create a second repository for ourselves called Ansible. Let's give it a name here. A quick description, and then in my case I'm going to leave this public because, as with all the chapters, the code I'm going to create in this course will be freely available for you to clone for reference and for copying purposes. I would actually advise following along and typing it if you can be bothered though, as endless Victorian-style repetition really is the magical formula to remembering stuff properly. Right, let's click Create. And as you may notice, I chose not to initialize with a README this time, as we've already created our Ansible directory. So we can just use the command git add remote here to connect that up to GitHub. If we switch back into the terminal, first we need to type git init to initialize this directory as a Git repo. Then let's paste in our git add remote command here that we copied from the website and connect it up to GitHub. Now our repository is created, we're good to start Ansible proper. Let's go over to Visual Studio Code and open our Ansible folder so we can get to creating some code. And again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, you can get the details of how to install and use VS Code in the Basics chapter if you don't already have it. First, we'll just make a simple README here. Now, as Ansible is concerned with adding configuration to servers, we're going to need a server to add some configuration to. There are a couple of easy ways you could get hold of one. Firstly, we could spin one up in the cloud, or secondly, we could make one the same way we made this Ubuntu desktop we're using a VirtualBox VM. Bearing in mind you're hopefully already working on a VirtualBox VM, you know how to do that already. So if you decide that's how you want to do it, hop over to the Ubuntu website and download yourself the latest server software there, and you'll be good to go. For this chapter though, I'm going to demonstrate how to do it using Terraform, as this chapter is part of the unified course I'm trying to teach, and I'm assuming that most of you have done the Terraform chapter. If so, it's definitely the quickest way to get a machine, but if not, feel free to just go and do one with VirtualBox or however else you want to go and get a server. I'll just quickly create a Terraform directory for our code here. I'll create main.tf as usual. And now, using the miracle of cut and paste, I'm going to dump in all the bits we need into this one file. This is bad practice in real life, as you know, but for our scrap server it's fine. We're just looking to get hold of a server with the right settings as quickly as possible. The code for all this is in the Ansible repo you can find at Lernard.com GitHub. I definitely recommend just going there, cut and paste it or steal it however you want to. I've added comments to tell you what all the parts do, but the only parts you actually need to change is the public key, which of course should be your own public key. This Terraform will add that key to the server we create, which will mean Ansible can automatically connect into it without us having to do anything. Hopefully you've got a key, in which case you could get it by typing cat home.ssh/id_rsa.pub. And all you have to do is copy it here, then go and paste it over the hard-coded one in the file. If you don't have a key, you can create one using the ssh keygen command. You can see here I'm referencing the key name here in the AWS_instance creation section. Right, apologies, this has had nothing to do with Ansible so far, but it's a super handy piece of prep to set us up for the rest of the chapter. Now we've put our public key into our copy and pasted Terraform server, let's initialize it with Terraform init, dry run it with the Terraform plan, and then apply it with Terraform apply. Done. Now we've got a perfectly configured server ready to have some Ansible done on it. You can see here it's outputted the IP of this server because I had an output section in my code, and I can demonstrate now that it's open to SSH by typing SSH-V for verbose, Ubuntu for the user, and then at that IP address. And there we go, we're connected into our new server on SSH. Let's exit straight out of that, and let's get out of our Terraform directory, as we're done with Terraform now we've got our server. I'm going to be using that same Terraform to spin up the server at the start of every section, but if you've made yourself a VirtualBox VM instead because that suits you better, just keep it and you can use that instead, there's no problem. I'll mention it again later, but for those of you that have used Terraform, don't forget when you finish working at the end of each day to spin down your machine, or you'll end up paying £10 a month. Right, let's make a folder in this section, and we'll call it Section 2. Hop into Visual Studio Code, and we can create our first Ansible specific file for this chapter. As per the diagram at the start, we'll call it hosts, and as I've only got one server, all I need to do is write one line here, the IP address of that server. Of course, this IP address will change each and every time I spin the server up and down, so you might well be wondering how the file keeps track of that. In industry, there are several ways around this. We can link Terraform and Ansible together, so Terraform populates this host file automatically every time a machine is created. Or even easier, we can just use fixed Route 53 host names we define in the Terraform, then access those via DNS. I'd certainly recommend that second option if you're doing a greenfield deployment, but there's several other ways to do it. But for this chapter, we're just going to be writing it in by hand, because there's only one server and we can afford to be lazy, we're not a massive company just yet. Next thing, we need to create our config file, which is always named ansible.config. As I mentioned, in our case, we'll define our config in the repository itself, and at this point, all we need to do is add a default username of Ubuntu. If I remember rightly, Ansible usually defaults to using whatever user you are currently logged in as if you don't specify this, but it's always a good idea to be specific in any case. So, open up a pair of curly brackets like this, write defaults, and now, underneath, write remote_user equals Ubuntu. Okay, now we've got our config and we've got our hosts file. The modules come pre-included, so we're ready to run our Ansible command. As we specified in the intro, this is going to be Ansible-m ping all-i hosts. I never mentioned what all was in the intro, but it's called a pattern and is used for specifying which hosts you want Ansible to hit within the hosts file. At the moment, we only have one host, so this isn't really relevant, but later in the chapter we'll cover this in detail as it's really useful. Let's run this now and see if it works. By default, Ansible will go and look for our SSH key in .ssh, where it usually lives, so we don't need any special configuration there if that's where we're keeping it. Success! Ansible has detected the server and found it to be discoverable. Just to illustrate something a tiny bit more interesting, let's try the shell module here. So here we write Ansible-m, then shell for the shell module, then -a for arguments and the command we want to run on the server, followed by all, then -i hosts again. Don't worry too much about memorising these, by the way, as it's going to change so much by the end of the chapter it's really not worth committing all this to memory just yet. It's just the starting example to just illustrate roughly how Ansible works. And there we go. We can see the result of running ifconfig on our remote server. It's returning the address details to us. So that's it for this section. We've installed Ansible, we've spun up a server to test against, and we've run some very basic commands. We're in a great place now to make this a bit more interesting and a bit more enterprise class in the next chapter. Lastly then, let's behave as if we're professional DevOps engineers and add all our changes back to Git. As this repo is brand new, we haven't yet created a git ignore, which we're definitely going to need to avoid checking in our Terraform plugins and state. We can easily get this by just nicking it from the last chapter. In my case, with copy --terraform.gitignore to copy the repo to the root. If you haven't got the Terraform chapter downloaded like I do to copy from, don't worry, you can just go and clone it right now into your repos folder from Lernard.com. It's all publicly available, or you can just go and cut and paste the details if you'd rather. Now we've got that, let's go back to the repo root, git status, and we can see our changes there, including the newly copied .gitignore. So now, git add -a to add them all to the repo, git commit with a sensible message, and finally, git push origin master to push them all back up to GitHub. Okay, we've come to the end of the section on installing Ansible, and we've shown that it works against our dummy server. In the next section, we're going to have a look at the playbook, one of the core concepts around which the whole structure of enterprise Ansible is built. So, hopefully see you there.